Chapter 27. He comes too near, who comes to be denied. Lady Cecil stayed at Pevenshall. Her first thought on hearing that Hector Gordon was to be an inmate of the house had been to go straight back to London without having so much as seen the man she dreaded. But a woman is very seldom free to follow her first thoughts. If a man wishes to escape from any given place at a moment's notice, he has only to declare himself called away on business, and lo, he is free to spring into the first hansom he encounters and start for the Antipodes, if he so pleases, without let or hindrance. But a woman cannot take an unexplained morning's walk without the dread of question and scandal. A few moments' reflection showed Cecil that escape from Pevenshall was a moral impossibility. What motive could she allege for such a proceeding? How account to the impetuous Flo, who would press her closely for her reasons? How explain her return to London to her husband, whose wonder would be aroused by her caprice? And if once people began to wonder and to question, might they not arrive at the miserable truth? An overwhelming terror seized her on the discovery of her helplessness. She found herself hemmed in on every side, powerless to fly from the pursuer she dreaded, run to earth like some hunted animal, and with no resource but to stand at bay and defy the cruel hunter. A strong-minded woman would perhaps have made light of the difficulties which surrounded the lawyer's wife. A real heroine would have bidden her hostess a hasty adieu and left the danger-haunted mansion without explanation or delay. But Cecil was not strong-minded. She had lived all her life in the dread of those little social laws which a woman sometimes finds it more difficult to break than to violate the law of heaven itself. She gave up all idea of flight. There was only one course which seemed possible to her, and that was to make an ad misericordiam appeal to Hector Gordon. A woman always hopes so much from the honor and generosity of a man, until she has made her appeal and discovered how frail a straw manly generosity may prove in the hour of peril. So Cecil met Major Gordon in the drawing-room where the Pevenshall guests had assembled. The party consisted of the deaf matron, who had an aristocratic nose and a placid imbecility of countenance. The deaf matron's husband, who was a retired half-pay colonel with a very red face, and that genius for gastronomy which seems the special faculty of the middle-aged warrior who has retired on his laurels. Two stylish girls who had been schoolfellows of Flo's, and a brace of curates from the neighbourhood. It was a very small assembly compared to the brilliant gathering of the last winter, and the great drawing-room looked almost tenantless. Cecil was very pale when she followed Florence into the room. The first glance told her that the man she dreaded was present. He was standing by one of the open windows talking to Colonel Henniker, while the curates entertained the two young ladies with mild local gossip, during the progress of which the deaf matron assumed that amiable air of interest which a man who has forgotten the French he learned at some juvenile academy is apt to wear during the recital of some piquant Parisian anecdote. Mrs. Lobbier conducted her friend straight to the placid matron. "My dear Mrs. Henniker, how shameful of me to be the last to come down, and on the first day, too. But I had no idea it was so late. How kind of you and the dear Colonel to come to me at such a short notice. And how have you left everyone in York? I looked for my Yorkshire friends in vain all the year. No one came to town except the Spaldings and the Appleys. Let me introduce my friend Lady Cecil O'Boynville. You were not with us last winter when she was here. And now I must go and welcome the Colonel and Major Gordon. Take care, Lucy. Mr. Somerton is dreadfully high church. How do you do, Laura? I'll come and talk to you presently, said the young matron to her sometime schoolfellows as she tripped away. Cecil plunged at once into a laborious conversation with Mrs. Henniker. How delightful the country was at this time of year, and how especially beautiful the scenery about Pevenshall, and so on. It was weary work, that stereotype talk, while the sense of Hector Gordon's vicinity exercised a bewildering influence on her thoughts and rendered the most commonplace conversation difficult. She was safe under shelter of the matron's wing when Hector came presently to greet her. She would not see his outstretched hand and received his greeting with freezing coldness. A desperate kind of courage possessed her in this extremity, and she determined all at once that she would humiliate herself by no ad misericordiam appeal. She would compel him to leave Pevenshall. She would awaken him to the sense of his own dishonour. Brave and defiant for the moment, she looked up at him with a proud, steady glance and silently challenged him with his baseness. He felt all the significance of that cold gaze, and his eyelids fell beneath it. "I have followed you, you see, Lady Cecil," he said, in a very low voice. She did not answer him, but turned to Mrs. Henniker and took up the thread of her vapid talk. "No, I never was in York, and I am really most anxious to see the Minster. Papa used to say he thought it finer than Rouen Cathedral, but I cannot fancy anything," and so on and so on. Hector Gordon placed himself opposite the two ladies and sat looking steadily at Cecil. She was conscious of that determined contemplation, but did not flinch beneath it, and she went on perseveringly with her disquisition upon the show places and rural beauties of Yorkshire. Major Gordon was obliged to offer his arm to Mrs. Henniker presently, when dinner was announced, while the portly colonel conducted his hostess, and Cecil was relegated to the care of the High Church curate. All that evening and all the next day, and for many days and evenings to come, Cecil preserved the same frigid demeanour towards Hector Gordon, and yet he did not leave Pevenshall. Again and again he tried to obtain a few moments' confidential conversation, but on every occasion he found himself baffled and repulsed. And yet he did not leave Pevenshall. A silent duel was always going on between these two. The poor hunted victim was always on the defensive. The hunter was merciless. By every possible stratagem, Cecil avoided the explanation she feared, but still the Major held his post obstinately, waiting for the chance which must come sooner or later. It came at last, when Cecil had been some weeks at Pevenshall, and when the house was beginning to fill. The York summer meeting was close at hand. Mr. Lobier had returned from Rouen triumphant, and was happy in the society of some of the choicer spirits of Manchester, renowned for their achievements on the turf, and all full of their York engagements. The Major's opportunity came at last. The nights were oppressively warm, and all visitors at Pevenshall under 40 years of age were in the habit of abandoning the drawing-room soon after dinner for the broad terrace in front of the open windows. Here, in the delicious moonlight, the party broke up into pleasant groups to saunter up and down the broad walk, or to gather in a knot at some angle of the stone balustrade. And hence more adventurous spirits wandered away in twos and threes and fours to circulate among the winding pathways of the gardens, where the rarest specimens of the pine tribe imparted a spicy odour to the night air. The windows of the billiard-room, as well as those of the drawing-room, opened on this delightful terrace, and a cluster of iron chairs in the neighbourhood of these windows marked the spot where Mr. Lobier and his particular friends were wont to congregate, making a little constellation with the luminous ends of their cigars. These summer evenings in the open air were very agreeable to the guests at Pevenshall, and the great clock in the quadrangle had generally struck 12 before the last of the strollers left the terrace. It was the place of places for flirtation, the place of places for that intimate converse which the French call causerie, and which is the next thing to flirtation. The eligible young men who had come down for the York summer and the marriageable young ladies found a good deal to say to one another on these balmy moonlight nights, and appropriate couplets from Tennyson, Owen Meredith, and Alfred de Musset were at a premium. Byron and Moore are rococo nowadays, and the most sentimental of damsels would stare in amazement at an admirer who should quote the Corsair or Lalla Rookh for her entertainment. Sir Nugent Evershed was still yachting, but Florence seemed very little affected by the absence of the chief of her worshippers. Other adorers flocked round her shrine, and she was content to receive their homage. To be admired was the only art she knew, and a life spent in the perpetual excitement derivable from new millinery left little time for serious thought. "I really believe I am the happiest creature in the world, Cecil," she said to the one friend whom she trusted with her secret thoughts, "for I am only unhappy when I think, and as I may almost say that I never think, it must follow that I am never unhappy." It was while sauntering on the terrace with Cecil on one of the warmest of the July nights that Florence thus addressed her friend. They had wandered away from the rest of the party, who gathered chiefly about the lighted windows of the drawing-room, whence an extra chair, or a forgotten shawl, or a cup of tea, or a glass of water, or any one of the trifles that womankind is always demanding from attendant man, could be fetched at a moment's notice, and where someone was always found willing to sing or play for the edification of the loungers outside the windows. Cecil and Florence had been walking up and down the deserted end of the terrace for some time, when the voice of Mr. Lobbyer, bawling, "Flo! Flo! Come here! I want to speak to you," was heard from the distance, and Cecil's companion hurried away to attend the bidding of her lord and master. Cecil was not sorry to find herself alone. Her life at Pevenshaw since the hour of her arrival had been one perpetual excitement. The silent battle for ever being fought against the man who loved her, and whose love had shown itself more pitiless than another man's hate, was not without its agony. The helpless wild creature brought to bay, and facing its hunter in the desperation of bitter despair, must suffer anguish something akin to that which Cecil had endured in the daily companionship of the lover she feared. She feared him. In vain she called upon her womanly pride to help her. In vain she supplicated better and surer help from that heaven her sin offended, even while she prayed. Day by day she fought her battle bravely, but a dim consciousness of coming danger perpetually oppressed her. The old simile of the precipice is the only comparison which fits the state of her mind. She felt like a creature walking in outer darkness near the verge of an abyss. She felt herself near the horrible danger. It was not inevitable that she should fall over the precipice, but the precipice was always there, always hidden by the thick darkness, and at any moment her ignorant footsteps might stray too near the fatal boundary. Thinking of that day of temptation and trial at Fortinbras, and all that had occurred since then, the young wife's untimely death, the return of Hector's regiment, the chance that had brought him to Pevenshaw, Cecil was inclined to yield to the weakest theory ever propounded by an invisible Satan for the corruption of womankind. The old classic machinery, the work of the Eumenides, seemed to have had part in all this story of unhappy love. Hector Gordon's return to England was Agamemnon's return over again, only this time the hero returned to destroy rather than to be destroyed, and it was the heroine for whom the fatal net was spread. Surely, when beguiling Eve to her ruin, the Miltonic Satan must amongst other arguments have urged that the fates had ordained her disobedience, and that she was predestined to taste the forbidden fruit. A weak-minded woman is always ready to mistake the action of a man's selfish obstinacy for the handiwork of the fates. Tonight, Cecil fancied herself abandoned to the Eumenides. For a few minutes after Mrs. Lobbyer had quitted her, a dark figure came between her and the moonlight, and looking up, she recognized Hector Gordon. "At last, Cecil," he said. She had been walking away from the animated assembly outside the drawing-room windows, but at sight of her persecutor she turned abruptly. He laid his hand upon her arm to stop her. "I must speak to you, Cecil," he said. "You have avoided me as if I were a pestilence ever since I came to this house. But do you think I am likely to submit to be avoided after the sacrifice I have made in order to come here?" "The sacrifice? What sacrifice?" cried Cecil. The barrier fell, and the foe rushed to his triumph. Cecil's only chance of defending the citadel had lain in a steady refusal to hold parley with the enemy. Entrapped into a conference, her best strength abandoned her. "Is it possible that you do not know how much I have sacrificed in order to be here by your side tonight? Oh, Cecil, there is a meanness in this affectation of ignorance. I have sacrificed my career, my position as a soldier, for your sake. Do you know what it is for a man to sell out of his regiment on the eve of a perilous service? If it were not for what I have done in India, I might be branded as a coward. As it is, in spite of what I did out there are men who will hint the possibility of my cowardice. You don't know, perhaps, how dear a soldier's career is to him. And yet, by the way men court dangerous service, you must know how much dearer reputation is to them than life. Why were you so foolish, so mad, as to remain in England? Because I love you. You had no right to remain. Do you remember what you said to me that night? You were going away. We might never see each other again. After that, You were bound in honor to go. I know that, but I could not go. After— He paused for a moment, and then said in a lower voice, after what I heard that night. I wish I had died before that night, cried Cecil passionately. She felt the darkness growing thicker round her, her feet wandering nearer to the precipice, and she was powerless as a dreamer fighting with shadows. It is my fate to be wicked and miserable, she thought. I wish I had died before that night, repeated Hector Gordon. I wish I had died in India or at Fortinbras. Oh, Cecil, you claim a right to blame me. It is I who have a right to reproach you for your coldness that day. One word and we should have been so happy. Not for a moment only, and there are some moments of happiness worth a commonplace lifetime, but for all our lives, innocently, serenely happy. It wanted only one word from you, Cecil. Only one little word. I tried to do my duty, and yet I loved you so dearly. The words were spoken unconsciously. She was thinking of that painful struggle between love and duty, and of the useless victory which she had gained. Utterly useless, since the battle had to be fought over again. No, no, Cecil, I cannot believe that you loved me, cried the soldier, seizing the slender hand which struggled in vain to free itself. You could not have been so cruel if you had loved me. They had walked away from the lights and the crowd, and were standing at the end of the terrace where there were vases full of flowers on the broad balustrade, and a life-size marble figure of Pomona which cast its shadow over them as they stood looking down at the sloping landscape, sublimely beautiful in the moonlight. The sense of her own dishonor and of the dishonor of the man who loved her was paramount in Cecil's mind, and yet she let him talk to her. That feeling of perfect helplessness, which holds the dreamer in its spell, possessed her as she stood by her lover's side in the dreamlike light and shadow of the summer night. I have not been altogether base, pleaded Hector. I spoke the truth that night at the opera, when I told you that I was going to leave England. It was not till some days after that I resolved to sell out. I should have held to my purpose. I firmly believe I should have left England if you had not so obstinately refused to see me when I called in Brunswick Square. I think an interview with you would have given me strength, Cecil, and I should have gone out yonder resigned to the misery of our separation. You had no right to try to see me after that night. You call me cruel. What could be more cruel or dishonorable than your conduct to me? You persecute me in my own house. You follow me here where I am powerless to escape from you. Is this the conduct of a gentleman, Major Gordon? It is the conduct of a man who is ready to trample reputation, honor, everything under his feet in order to be near the woman he loves. But how can I expect you to understand all this? You have never loved me. If you had loved me, you would not have married O'Boynville. I have married a man who is more than worthy of my affection and gratitude. Yes, and who is about as capable of appreciating you as Mr. Lobia is capable of understanding that Leonardo da Vinci, which he brought from Rome. Major Gordon, I will not allow you to speak so of my husband. If you cannot respect him as I respect him, it is better that his name should never be mentioned between us. Much better, for I cannot speak of him with patience. Can you imagine what I felt, Cecil, when I received my aunt's letter announcing your marriage? I had married another woman, loving you, and you only, all the time, because you had decided that I was bound to keep my promise. I kept my word to my poor, true-hearted girl at the cost of my happiness. But you, Cecil, you were bound by no old contract, and yet within so short a time of our parting, all memory of my love was blotted from your mind, and you were ready to marry this O'Boynville. All memory of the past was not blotted from my mind. I had tried to forget, honestly and truly, but I know now to my cost that I never really forgot that time at Fortinbras. Oh, Major Gordon, why do you force me to say these things? I hate myself for listening to you. I hate myself for talking to you. You could never understand why I married Mr. O'Boynville. You could never have imagined the weariness of my life and my bitter need of some friend and protector. My chief unhappiness arises from the fact that my husband's profession will not allow him to be the friend I hoped he would be, and you know this. You know how lonely I am, and you take advantage of my defenselessness. It is cruel and unmanly, Major Gordon." She lost all self-command as she said this, and burst into tears, whereupon Hector humiliated himself to the very dust, imploring her forgiveness, and declaring that he would leave Pevenshul. He would tear himself from her for ever and ever, rather than he would inflict pain upon the woman he loved so dearly. And then came those perilous promises which a man is apt to make on such occasions. He implored her to trust him. What was there in all the world so precious to him as her happiness? He confessed his own guilt. He had been reckless, heedless of everything in his passionate desire to see her once more, to speak to her once again. And now that he had spoken, he would be content. He would go away resigned to the idea of their eternal separation. Cecil dried her tears during these protestations. "I wish to believe in your sincerity," she said, "but there is no occasion for you to leave Pevenshall. I shall go back to town tomorrow morning. Good night." "You're going in at once?" "Yes, I am very tired. Let me take you back to the house, at least." "No, thanks. I would rather go by myself." She walked away, leaving him leaning against the balustrade under the shadow of the marble pomona. This time she believed the battle had been won, but there was a keen sense of shame mingled with the triumph of victory. She contrived to reach her own rooms without encountering anyone, and packed everything ready for her departure before going to bed. She announced her intention to Mrs. Lobbyer before breakfast the next morning, and encountered the opposition which she had expected from that lady. "You must stay for the York summer," Flo said decisively. "Sir Nugent Evershed's horses are to run, and he and all his set will be there in full force. Grace is coming home from Switzerland, and is to give me a week immediately, and you know you like Grace." "I like her very much, and I am very sorry to leave you, Flo, but I must go." "Why must? Give me an adequate reason, and you shall be worried no more, but I must have a reason." "Mr. O'Boynville wishes me to return." "Has he written to tell you so?" "Yes." It was the first deliberate falsehood Cecil had ever told, and she blushed as she uttered it. "But I thought he was on circuit." "His circuit work is just over." "Oh, very well, Cecil. If your duty as a wife compels you to depart, I suppose I must submit. But I am so sorry to lose you." "And I am sorry to leave you, dear. There is a train leaves Chiverley at 3. I thought of going by that." "Then we will take an early luncheon, and I will drive you to the station." "Good morning, Major Gordon," cried Mrs. Lobbyer as that gentleman entered the room. "Here is Lady Cecil going to run away from us, just as our party is beginning to be pleasant. Don't you think she is very unkind?" "I think there can scarcely be any real reason for Lady Cecil's departure," answered the Major. "A lady is always mistress of her time. It is another matter with us. I find by my letters of this morning that I shall be obliged to leave Pevenshall in a day or two. I need scarcely say how much I shall regret going away." "There now," cried Flo, "that is always my fate. If one nice person goes away, other nice people begin to take fright directly. You army men find that desertion is infectious, I believe, Major Gordon." Cecil spent the morning in her own rooms, under pretence of making preparations for departure that had been made overnight. She was feverishly anxious to be away from Pevenshall, and she went down to luncheon in her travelling dress. "The ponies are to be ready at 1:30, said Flo, "and one of the men has taken your luggage already in a cart. You see, I am heroic enough to speed the parting guest when I am told departure is inevitable. Major Gordon, will you give Lady Cecil one of those cutlets?" Cecil declined anything so substantial as a cutlet, but took 2 or 3 sips from a glass of pale sherry for the satisfaction of her hostess. In her eagerness to escape from the house that sheltered Hector Gordon, she felt an unreasoning dread of some hindrance to her departure. Her eyes wandered to the clock on the chimney-piece every now and then, while Flo was absent preparing for the drive, and it was with difficulty that she went through the ordeal of bidding adieu to Mrs. Lobbyer's guests, who were all so sorry to find she was really going, and so anxious to meet her again before long. "Though I am sure we can never meet in such a pleasant house as this," said a genial widow who appreciated the liberty and luxury of Mr. Lobbier's mansion. Flo came back to the dining room at last, equipped for the drive, and everybody left the table to bid a last goodbye to Lady Cecil. The two ladies went out together with a posse of people following them, and in the hall they encountered a stalwart gentleman who had just alighted from a lumbering fly, and who pounced upon Cecil and kissed her before the assembled multitude. "I have not forgotten your hearty invitation, you see, Mrs. Lobbier," said the stalwart gentleman, who was no other than the great O'Boynville. "My circuit work has been rather lighter than usual this year, and I have come over from Carlisle to spend a few days at Pevenshall." "I am so glad," cried Flo. "And that letter?" "What letter?" "The letter asking Cecil to go back to town." "I wrote no letter asking Cecil to go back to town." "Oh, Cecil," said Mrs. Lobbier. "I am sorry you were so tired of us all." Cecil blushed crimson and cast an imploring look at her friend, who stared at her in supreme mystification. "I suppose I may send away the pony carriage," said Flo. "You will not think any more of leaving us." "Not till Mr. O'Boynville goes." "And that will not be till after the races, I hope." "I will stay for the races. I will stay for any diversion you please to offer me, Mrs. Lobbier," cried the barrister cheerily. "I am my own man for the next 6 weeks, and your devoted slave. What a delightful place this is in summer, and what scenery! Ah, Gordon, how do you do? I thought you were off to Japan." He seemed bigger and more boisterous than usual, Cecil thought, as she went back with him to the dining room, where the interrupted luncheon began again, and where Mr. O'Boynville entertained the company with some delightful anecdotes of the provincial law courts. So Lady Cecil stayed at Pevenshall, trusting that Hector Gordon would keep his promise and depart immediately. Chapter 28. Were all thy letters suns, I could not see. While the butterflies of fashion enjoyed the bright summer-time, and brazen bands brayed their loudest in horticultural gardens, and foreign glee singers carolled in every imaginable European language at morning concerts and lawn parties, William Crawford shut himself in his painting room and worked as he had never worked since the old days in Buckingham Street, when the world had yet to learn that there was a painter called Crawford. He had nothing left him now but his art. He reminded himself of that fact very often as he stood before his easel in the balmy summer weather, while suburban butterflies wheeled above his roses and a suburban bee boomed and bounced against the old stained glass in his bay window. Time had been when the painter had found his art more than sufficient for his life, and when his chief regret had been that life was not long enough for art. But the elegant siren of the hermitage had disturbed the even current of his existence, and it was in vain that he tried to coax the stream back into its old course. "I begin to think that I shall never paint another picture," he said to himself, after abandoning more than one design in despair. "I make sketch after sketch, but my ideas lose their freshness before I am ready to begin upon my large canvas. Have I lost my love for my art in loving her? Or what is this restless, feverish uncertainty which takes the power out of my hand? I will not be the slave of this folly. I have outlived bitterer sorrows than the loss of Mrs. Champernowne's society. I lived down the trouble of my young wife's death. I survived 10 years of perpetual failure and disappointment, and am I to succumb at the very last because a woman is selfish and heartless? No, I will forget Georgina Champernowne. I will paint a better picture than I have ever painted yet." After arriving at this resolution, Mr. Crawford abandoned his brushes and palette for one entire day and shut himself in his library. He took down his favourite volumes, the sweet familiar stories of the Greek fairyland, and all the lovely images which had made the brightest dreams of his inspired boyhood came back to him and floated around him once more, in spite of Mrs. Champernowne. His Psyche's enchanting face bent over him as he sat dreaming in the drowsy summer noon. His Cupid peered at him in all the godlike beauty of immortal youth, and innumerable nymphs, innumerable sirens filled the room with their aerial loveliness. He went back to his painting room the next morning with new enthusiasm and with all the details of his picture fully developed in his mind. "Come, my divinity," he cried. "Come, my bright incarnation of the immortal soul. and put to flight all earthly follies by your divine presence. As I am a man and a painter, I will forget you, Mrs. Champernowne, and my new picture shall plant me a round higher on the glorious ladder. From the beginning of May to the end of July, William Crawford worked incessantly at the large canvas which he had set up for himself in his despair. No hand but his own had any part in the work, for he was possessed with a feverish delight in his labour which he had never, even in his most industrious days, felt before. He worked all through the long summer days by good lights and bad lights, entering his painting room at 8 o'clock in the morning, rarely to leave it till 7 in the evening. He took his hasty meals in that tapestried chamber amongst the black oak cabinets and trailing draperies. The servants at the fountains remarked the change in their master's habits, and talked gravely of his haggard face and restless, impatient manner. "He used to be the best of tempers," said the painter's man of all work, "but now it's as much as you can do to open your mouth without getting your nose snapped off, which the young person that comes to sit for his fishkey says his tempers about her attitudes is something awful, and that he's got no more consideration for her elbow joints than if she was his wooden dummy. Which, I'm sure, up to 2 or 3 months back, there wasn't a pleasanter gentleman or a better master than Mr. Crawford. It is good for a mortal to be reminded of his mortality at that moment, when his yearnings towards a brighter universe have lifted him away from this dull earth, and are wafting him towards that serener region in which dwell the perfect images of his fancy. There are limits beyond which no man can go, and during the last 3 months of his life, William Crawford had been trying to overstep those limits. In the hope of forgetting the woman he loved, he had thrown himself into his work with a burning eagerness for success that was dangerous to him alike as a man and an artist. "If other men work 6 hours a day, I will work 12, he thought. "I have nothing to live for now but my work." This was the refrain of his life nowadays. What had he to live for but his art? And if he did not do great things in that, what purpose was there left for his existence? The subject of his new picture was only another chapter in his favourite fable, the story of Psyche. She lay asleep under a tent, with the young god by her side, sleeping like herself, divinely innocent in the unconsciousness of slumber. A crowd of zephyrs, holding one another by the hand, have come to peep at the sleeping lovers. They float on a wandering ray of moonlight. They hover in aerial circles about the lovely sleepers. Never had William Crawford achieved a greater triumph than in the creation of these ethereal beings, transparent as water drops against a moonlit sky, with sweet arch faces and gauzy wings. And the slumbering Psyche, with her fair infantine face, and her veil of pale golden hair, and the divine moonlight, and the mysterious depths of cool shadow, every detail of the picture was a triumph, and as the work neared its completion, the painter began to feel that he had at least surpassed himself. When Sheridan was slow to write a new comedy, they said he was afraid of the author of The School for Scandal, and people have declared that I should never equal the painter of the Aspasia. But I think I have beaten the Aspasia at last, mused Mr. Crawford as he stood before his easel and pondered on the aerial charms of his zephyrs. He had worked by bad lights and good lights, in sunshine and shadow. He had grappled with and mastered the difficulties to which he had been wont to succumb. Not content with doubling the daily hours of his labour, he had worked at his background at night. There had been no reason for his abnormal industry except his own restlessness, but that restlessness was unconquerable. The intoxication of success took possession of him, and he allowed himself neither pause nor respite. There came a time when, under any other phase of circumstances, he would have laid down his palette and left his painting room. There came a time when he felt that his sight was beginning to suffer from unwanted use, but still he went on. "I can rest as long as I like when my zephyrs are finished," he said to himself. "If I were to leave my picture, I might lose the freshness of my ideas. I might even take a disgust for my lovely Psyche." So the painter held on steadily, in spite of a curious languor which made his eyelids heavy and an occasional visitation from a strange throbbing pain above his eyebrows. He went on, promising himself a consultation with some distinguished oculist and a long rest when his Psyche and the Zephyrs was finished. He continued his work with unrelenting industry, indomitable determination. But there were moments in which the beautiful faces upon his canvas disappeared suddenly behind a dazzling mist, until he was fain to lay down his brushes and walk up and down the room for a little while with his hands before his tired eyes. It was the middle of August, and the picture wanted little more than a week's work for its completion, when the painter yielded for the first time to that languid feeling in the eyelids, and abandoned his work in order to indulge in a brief siesta. All the clocks of Kensington had just struck 3, and the vibration of the different chimes came floating across the painter's garden. It was an almost insupportable summer day, sultry and oppressive, the day of all others on which the hardest worker is apt to be seized with a distaste for his labour. "It's no use," said Mr. Crawford, as he gave a last look at his canvas. "I can scarcely see the colours I am using. I can't stand against this drowsiness any longer." He threw himself upon a sofa, a noble conch of strictly classic form, upon which had erst reclined Aspasia, the wise and beautiful, or at any rate the dark-haired model who had sat for the Grecian beauty, that maligned enchantress who sinned against poetry by descending from a Pericles to a cattle dealer. The painter fell asleep almost immediately, but for some time after he had lain down, he had a dim consciousness of pain above his eyebrows. By and by, however, the slumber grew deeper. He no longer heard the bees humming in his roses, the subdued roll of distant wheels. He fell into a long, dreamless sleep, from which he awoke at last very suddenly, with a feeling that he had slept for many hours. He had slept for a very long time, as it seemed, for it was quite dark when he awoke. "No more work today," he thought with a sigh. "I counted on getting an hour between 5 and 6. Why hasn't Diamond lighted my lamps?" The painter groped his way to the bell and rang violently. "What a night," he muttered. "There must be a storm brewing. I haven't known it as dark as this all the summer." He stood by the mantelpiece waiting. The window was opposite him, and he felt the warm summer air floating in upon him where he stood, but he could not even define the broad opening of the window through the profound darkness. "Lights, Diamond," he said impatiently, as the man opened the door. "Lights, sir?" "Yes, of course. Why have you left the lamps till this time? Why isn't that passage lighted?" "But it's so early, sir. Not much after 5, and such a bright afternoon. I didn't think you'd like me to light the gas yet a while." "Not much after 5 o'clock," repeated the painter in a tone of utter stupefaction. "No, sir, just a quarter past by your own clock, sir." "And a bright afternoon?" he asked in the same tone. "Well, of course, sir. I don't presume to say as regards painting, but in a general way a very bright afternoon." "Oh, my God!" cried the painter suddenly. The servant ran to his master, alarmed by that sudden exclamation, which sounded like a cry of agony. "Is anything the matter, sir?" "No. Go. Go and get me a cab, immediately. I must go out, and I shall want you to go with me." "Me, sir?" "Yes, you, sir. Go at once, man, for God's sake, and lose no time about it." The servant departed in bewilderment of mind, and William Crawford groped his way through the outer darkness to the nearest chair. He sunk into the chair, covered his face with his hands, and burst into tears. "Blind!" he cried. "Blind! Blind! I said I had nothing but my art, and now my art is lost to me." He sat with his head bent forward on his breast, staring hopelessly into the darkness. Strain his eyeballs as he might, they could not pierce that darkness. He saw no Psyche and the zephyrs, no lovely images created by his hand, no bright glimpse of summer sunshine on the smooth green lawn, no changing light upon the summer flowers, no tender shadows from the grand old cedars, only darkness, utter darkness, beyond which it might be that his eyes were never again to penetrate. "Cab, sir," said the man, presenting himself in the doorway. "Come here, Diamond," William Crawford said very quietly. "Come close to me and give me your arm, please. I beg your pardon if I was impatient just now, but I have had a great shock. I have been working too hard lately and have injured my sight. God only knows whether the injury is to be a lasting one, but for the moment I am quite blind. I think perhaps I shall manage better if you give me your hand to lead me to the cab. I must go at once to an oculist, and I shall want you to go with me. Chapter 29. A Timely Warning. Mr. O'Boynville enjoyed himself amazingly at Pevenshall. The man whose ordinary existence was one unceasing round of hard work was the most social of creatures when once set free from the daily round of labour. He enjoyed himself with a boisterous, boyish delight in simple pleasures, and the Pevenshall visitors found his gaiety contagious. There are some people who succeed in society by mere force of animal spirits, and who are pardoned for solecisms that would be the perdition of a more timid blunderer. Lawrence O'Boynville did what he liked and said what he liked, with the reckless impulsiveness of his nation, and people forgave him and were pleased with him. He gave himself up so thoroughly to the social delights of Mr. Lobyer's mansion, which was made all the pleasanter by the frequent absence of its master, that he had no leisure for morbid anxieties of a domestic nature. The idea that he had any need to doubt the allegiance of the wife he loved and honoured had never presented itself to him in any shape, howsoever impalpable. She was his wife, a creature so much above suspicion that only the rudest of awakenings could disturb his perfect confidence in her honour and truth. That he might leave her in one moment, bright, beautiful, and smiling, and return in the next to find her dead, was a possibility within his power of conception. But that he could awake from his trust in her to find her false to him was a monstrous impossibility which his mind would have been unable to grasp. So he gave himself up to the pleasure of the hour, and devoted himself to the service of the fair sex with an indiscriminate and laborious gallantry, which the gilded youth fluttering around Mrs. Lobyer and drawling some subtle half-implied compliment once in the 24 hours beheld with amazement from afar off. "I had no idea that Mr. O'Boynville was such a delightful creature," Flo remarked to Cecil. "I hope I shall never again be without an Irishman in the house when I have a large party. That dear good-tempered husband of yours contrives to keep all the women in good humour. I'm sure that poor Miss Scarecrow had never had a civil word said to her on the subject of her personal appearance till Mr. O'Boynville told her she was the image of the Empress of the French. He assured Miss Skeechuel that her voice reminded him of Greasy in her prime. And then there is pretty Mrs. Fitzcavendish, the attaché's wife, who has been surfeited with admiration, but who declares that there never was such an absurdly delightful creature as your husband." Cecil acknowledged these praises somewhat coldly. This noisy, frivolous Irishman, whom other people thought so delightful, was no nearer to her than the overworked barrister of Brunswick Square. She was weak enough to feel something like anger against him for his genial good temper, for his utter blindness to her own deadly peril. Hector Gordon had broken his promise. He had stayed at Pevenshall, and in the social intercourse of that pleasant mansion it was impossible for Cecil to avoid his companionship. Nor did Lawrence O'Boynville's presence shield her in any manner from that dangerous association. Serene in perfect confidence, the barrister amused himself noisily at one end of the drawing-room, while Major Gordon talked to his wife at the other. So perverse is the human heart that this placid trustfulness offended the woman who was trusted. Cecil resented her husband's confidence as an evidence of indifference, and was angry with him for not being jealous. "If I had a husband who loved me, he would come between me and my danger," she thought bitterly, "but my husband does not know what love is." Unhappily, there was someone at Pevenshall who did know, or who pretended to know, all the mysteries of that fatal passion. Someone whose voice sounded very often in Cecil's ear, whose eyes were forever seeking hers. Heaven knows that she did her best to avoid him, but her best efforts were very weak and futile as compared to the machinery which the Eumenides employed against her. 1,000 little circumstances conspired to force her into the society of the man she feared. At races and picnics and water parties and rustic gatherings of every description, she was always finding Hector Gordon by her side. The old companionship of the Fortinbras time rose again, but now there was always a guilty consciousness, a remorseful agony lurking amidst the unhallowed happiness. And oh, the meanness, the deception, the grovelling guiltiness, which was the everyday cost of that forbidden joy. Balancing one against the other, Cecil knew how heavily the perpetual remorse outweighed those brief moments of feverish gladness when the sound of Hector's voice lulled her with its fatal music, and the tender pressure of Hector's hand lifted her above the common earth. If I could get away to some quiet hiding place at the other end of the world, where he could not follow me, I might escape him and be innocent and happy once more, she thought. That escape for which she yearned seemed every day more difficult. The poor, frail, rudderless bark was hovering on the very brink of a whirlpool, and there was no friendly hand to steer it back to safety. Sometimes Cecil resolved that she would confess everything to her husband and demand the shelter she needed, but the barrister's good-humoured indifference was more repellent to her in her present frame of mind than the fiercest severity of a jealous husband could possibly have been. It would have been a relief to her to be suspected. She wanted an occasion to throw herself into her husband's arms and cry, "Have pity upon my wickedness and save me from myself." Perhaps in these latter days, when the chronicles of the divorce court furnish such piquant reading for middle-class breakfast tables, it would be well if husbands were a little more inclined to jealous watchfulness and somewhat less disposed to believe implicitly in their own invincible claims to all love and duty. More than once had Cecil nerved herself for the ordeal. She had resolved on humiliating herself before the husband whose indifference wounded her, but after waiting for an hour or more in the loneliness of her own apartment until it should please her lord and master to withdraw himself from some social masculine gathering in the smoking room below, after waiting with the words she meant to speak arranging and rearranging themselves in her brain, the remorseful wife found it impossible to begin her guilty story and to open her heart to a man who was chuckling over the capital things he had been saying and who insisted on relating the triumphs he had just achieved in argument. Against that everyday joviality, that commonplace good humour, the flood tide of passion dashed impotently as storm-beaten waters break against a groin of solid masonry. So the days went by, and Mr. O'Boynville enjoyed himself, while the fates worked their worst against helpless Cecil, who found herself day by day in more frequent association with the man who loved her, and who persisted in reminding her perpetually of his love. Pevenshall was very full and very gay. Amid so many people and so much gaiety flirtations that would have made scandal in a quieter household passed unnoticed, except by a few quiet watchers unengaged by schemes of their own. Sir Nugent Evershed appeared at the York meeting, where one of his horses ran a bad second for the Great Ebor, and after the races was almost a daily guest at Mr. Lobbier's mansion. The Irish barrister had been some time at Pevenshall when Mrs. Maclaverhouse arrived on a flying visit. She had been visiting further north, and she took Mrs. Lobbier's house on her way homewards, in accordance with an old promise made to Flo, who liked the lively dowager. "I must only stay with you 3 or 4 days at the most, my dear," she said to her hostess, "for I am due in Hampshire next week at a dear old rectory which is supposed to be haunted, though I must confess the ghosts have never come my way. But there are some people who may spend their lives in tapestried chambers and not see anything out of the common." Before Mrs. Maclaverhouse had been half a dozen hours at Pevenshall, she had taken occasion to interrogate her nephew respecting the sale of his commission. She put him through so sharp an examination that the Major was fain to confess the existence of motives which it was impossible for him to explain. "Then they must be bad motives," exclaimed the Dowager, "and unworthy of the true-hearted lad I used to be so proud of. You can't suppose that I wished you to go out to Japan to be killed by a herd of horrible creatures with small eyes and pigtails. But I have heard people speak sneeringly about your sudden selling out, and the malicious wretches have made me feel quite uneasy." "You needn't be uneasy, my dear aunt," answered Hector. "It's not a case of the white feather, if that's what you mean." "That's not what I mean, and you know as well as I do that it is not. I don't like those mysterious motives which you can't explain." The Major shrugged his shoulders with a deprecating gesture. He might give his aunt Indian shawls and ivory caskets and carte blanche upon his wine merchant, but there were secrets which he did not hold himself bound to reveal to that lady. She took his refusal very quietly. "When people object to tell me things, I generally contrive to find them out for myself," she said calmly, "and from this time Though she enjoyed the delights of Pevenshall to the uttermost, she kept a sharp eye upon her handsome nephew, and an assiduous ear for all floating gossip that accidental breezes wafted in her way. She stayed a week, and on hearing that Mr. O'Boynville had occasion to run up to town on the day following her intended departure, she delayed that departure in order to avail herself of his escort. "I suppose you won't object to take care of an old woman between this and King's Cross, Mr. O'Boynville," she said, after proposing this arrangement. Of course, the barrister declared himself delighted to be of service, but Cecil, who knew her strong-minded kinswoman's independent spirit, was not a little surprised by this sudden desire for masculine protection. Mr. O'Boynville was only to sleep one night in Brunswick Square, and then go on to the west of England, where he had business of importance to transact for a friend. The affair would not occupy him more than a week, he said, and he should hurry back to Pevenshall directly he was free to do so. Cecil made no objection to this arrangement. It pleased her husband to leave her in order to attend to his business, and she let him go. A strange calmness had taken possession of her during the last few days. She was absent-minded and frequently answered at random. More than once she had complained of headache and had kept her room. But when her husband asked her if there was anything serious the matter and entreated her to see a medical man, she assured him that her illness was only nervous. The dowager visited her on this occasion and questioned her sharply, but, for the first time in her experience, that worthy matron found herself repulsed by a sullen obstinacy on the part of her niece. "Your questioning me won't cure my headache," Lady Cecil said. "Believe me, it is much better to let me alone. I am not worth the trouble you take about me." "But, Cecil, if you are really ill, I must insist upon your having advice. And if you are not ill, this shutting yourself up in your room is very absurd. That dear good O'Boynville is most uneasy about you." The stentorian laughter of the dear good O'Boynville, floating upward in the summer air, made itself heard at this moment through the open windows. The barrister was enjoying himself on the terrace with the most lively of the Pevenshall visitors. "Yes, he is very uneasy about me, auntie," said Cecil. "Anyone can perceive that." Mrs. Maclaverhouse gave an impatient shrug and departed. "If I had been your mother in the days when George the Third was a young man, and pert chits like you were taught to respect their elders, how soundly I would have boxed those pretty little ears of yours. A sound box on the ear is what you want, Lady Cecil, and I only wish that Lawrence O'Boynville were the man to give it to you." Thus soliloquized the dowager, as she lingered for a few moments at the door of her niece's chamber. She encountered Hector Gordon by and by in the lower regions, and treated him more cavalierly than that favourite of fortune was wont to be treated. He bore her ill usage very meekly, and carefully avoided the severe glare of those hard grey eyes which had been apt to soften when they looked at him. On the next morning the dowager and Mr. O'Boynville took their departure. Cecil bade them adieu in a strange mechanical manner, which the barrister was too busy and too hurried to notice. He did indeed perceive that his wife was paler than usual, and that she drew herself away from him when he would have embraced her at parting. But the pallor was accounted for by the nervous headache, from which she confessed herself still a sufferer, and the chilling refusal of the embrace was attributed to the inconvenient presence of the matched footmen who were on guard in the hall, and of Mr. and Mrs. Lobbyer, who had emerged from the dining-room to speed their parting guests. The generous-minded Othello needs a hint from Iago before he can see flaw or speck in Desdemona's purity, though she may plead never so persistently for Cassio's reinstatement, and the idea that his wife's conduct had any hidden meaning was still far away from Lawrence O'Boynville's mind. "I shall come back for you in a week, Cecil," he said, and amid the confusion of adieus and good wishes, he had no time to perceive his wife's silence. At the station, Mrs. Maclaverhouse suggested that the barrister should secure a compartment for their own special use by the diplomatic administration of a half-crown to the guard. "I want to have a little quiet talk with you as we go up to town," she said. Mr. O'Boynville complied, wondering. At the first junction the branch train melted into an express, which tore London wards at the rate of 50 miles an hour. But Mrs. Maclaverhouse and her nephew-in-law had their quiet talk in spite of the ponderous pantings of the giant that was bearing them to their destination. And the quiet talk must needs have been of a very serious nature, for the barrister was as pale as a ghost when he alighted at King's Cross. He conducted Mrs. Claverhouse to a cab, nevertheless, and saw her packages and her maid safely bestowed along with her in that vehicle. On bidding her adieu, he bent his head to say something which was not to be heard by the maid. "I thank you very much," he said. "Very much. I am not afraid. No, Mrs. Claverhouse, with God's help, I am not afraid." Chapter 30. His sweetest friend or hardest foe. While Mr. O'Boynville was parting with the Dowager at the terminus, Cecil walked with Hector Gordon on the terrace at Pevenshall. The August afternoon was almost stifling in its sultry heat, and most of the Pevenshall idlers had taken shelter in the drawing-room. A group of young ladies were clustered under a great beech on the lawn, listening to the perusal of a new novel, and with the exception of this party and the two promenaders on the terrace, the gardens were deserted. Cecil and Hector walked slowly up and down the terrace. For some time they had been silent. It was one of those oppressive days which weigh down the liveliest spirits. But on Cecil's face there was a profound melancholy not to be accounted for by atmospheric influences. Nor was the countenance of the Major much brighter of aspect. He seemed divided between his own sombre thoughts and an anxious curiosity as to the meditations of his companion. "Tell me you are not unhappy, darling," he said at last. "For pity's sake, tell me that the idea of the step you have decided upon taking does not make you unhappy." "You do not think that I can feel very happy, do you, Hector? If you love me as I—" "Does the thought of our future make you happy?" cried Cecil passionately. "Oh, Hector, you know as well as I do that henceforward happiness must be impossible for you and me. It is agreed that we cannot endure the miserable deception, the shameful degradation of our lives any longer, that we must escape from this atmosphere of falsehood at any sacrifice, at any cost to ourselves. We have discussed this so often that there is no need of further discussion, and you have brought me to see things as you see them. You have wrung a promise from me, and I am prepared to keep it. But for mercy's sake, do not talk to me of happiness." The soldier ventured no reply to this speech. The gloom deepened upon his countenance as he watched the pale face of his companion. They came to the end of the terrace presently, and paused under the statue of Pomona, as they had done in the moonlight some weeks before. They stood here side by side for some time, she looking straight before her at the drowsy summer landscape, keeping close watch upon her face. She had promised to leave her husband with Hector Gordon. She had promised to pass away with him into the outer darkness, beyond the confines of the only world she knew. By what passionate pleading, by what subtle argument, her lover had brought her to accept this course as a fatal necessity need not be set down here. When a man's infatuation or a man's selfishness overrides his sense of truth and honor, he can find arguments enough to serve him in such a cause. That he loved her was beyond all question, that the penalty involved in his dishonor was scarcely less than the sacrifice to be made by her was also true. But it was no less true that the passion which demanded so cruel a sacrifice was a base and selfish one. It is difficult to imagine how any woman can arrive at such a decision as that made by Lady Cecil. The descent of Avernus is so gradual a slope that it is only when the traveller finds himself at the bottom of the gulf that he perceives how terrible has been the rapidity of his progress. Ample opportunity had been given Hector Gordon for the pleading of his wicked cause. The fates had conspired to assist his evil work, and even when some short-lived pang of self-reproach prompted him to abandon his relentless pursuit, some little circumstance, too insignificant to be remembered, always occurred to strangle the feeble resolution. Little by little, Cecil had learnt to believe that the tie between herself and her husband must needs be broken. She had learnt to believe that the daily and hourly deceptions of the last few weeks constituted a more terrible sin than any open rupture with the man she had sworn to love and honour. The seducer's fatal philosophy had done its work, and she accepted the justice of his reasoning. It was surely better that she should forfeit the place she had no right to hold in her husband's confidence and esteem. Better that he should know her for a false wife, an outcast from him and from society, than that he should trust her as a true one, while her love and allegiance were really given to another. This was the conviction which had taken possession of Cecil's mind. She was prepared to leave her husband and abandon her home and station for the fatal protection of a lover, but she had no hope of any future happiness to be won by this terrible sacrifice. She sought only to escape from the daily falsehood that tortured and humiliated her. It was within a very short period that this fatal conviction had taken root in her heart. Before that time she had trusted in her own honour, in Hector Gordon's forbearance, in her husband's power to save her from herself. But her own sense of honour had been weak to sustain her against a lover's subtle power of reasoning. Hector had shown no forbearance, and her last hope in the protection of her husband had been disappointed by reason of Lawrence O'Boinville's unsympathetic joviality. Looking at her this afternoon as they stood silently side by side, Hector saw something like despair in the pale, still face. It was not a hopeful aspect of affairs for a lover who had sacrificed so much in order to induce the woman he loved to break the bonds that bound her to another man and plight her perjured faith to him. He had won her promise to be his, but she had not promised to be happy, and a chilling sense of terror thrilled through his heart as he fancied that perhaps she had spoken the truth just now, and that henceforward there could be no such thing as happiness for these two who loved each other so dearly. He had not calculated upon this. Cecil might desire only to escape from a miserable present, but Hector had believed in a bright future. What could mar his happiness if the woman he loved was his companion, his own for ever and for ever? Loss of position, tarnished honour, the memory of a great wrong done to an unsuspecting man, what were these but trifles when weighed in the balance with an all-absorbing love? The ordeal through which he must needs drag the creature he loved so dearly might indeed be a terrible one. But once past, the future lay bright and fair before them, a future in which they would be together. But now all at once a new light dawned upon him. He might be happy, for how could he be otherwise than happy with her? But would she be content? That calm despair in the pale face gave no promise of peace. Poor girl, poor girl, it is harder for her than for me, he thought sadly. And then presently some brief awakening of conscience impelled him to speak. Cecil, he cried, it is not too late. If you wish to retract, if you repent your promise— No, I will keep my promise. I never can go back to my husband any more. If he loved me, if there were any sympathy between us, he might have saved me from myself, Hector, and from you. Oh, I know how selfish this must sound. You have sacrificed so much for me, your career, your future. I have learnt to understand the sacrifice since I have heard people wonder why you took such a step. And it was for my sake. No, Hector, I will not break my promise. I should be weak, dishonourable, selfish beyond all measure, if I could break my promise after what it has cost you to win it. A woman has always more or less inclination for self-sacrifice. Let her once be fully persuaded that it is her duty to throw herself away for the welfare or the pleasure of someone she loves, and she is in hot haste to take the fatal step that shall hurl her to destruction. Cecil was not a woman who could entertain any hope of happiness from such a course as that which she was about to take. If she could make her lover happy, if she could atone to him in some manner for the foolish sacrifice of his career, she would be content. But no false glamour illumined her miserable pathway. She was going to her destruction, blindly perhaps, but with a full knowledge that there was darkness around her, and that no light could ever shine upon the way she was treading. Hector talked to her of their plans, and she listened quietly and acquiesced in all his arrangements. The details of their flight had been settled before today. The Major was to leave Pevenshall in the evening by the mail on pretence of some sudden summons for which his afternoon letters would furnish the excuse. Cecil was to leave the next morning in obedience to a letter from her husband. In the way which they were going, there seemed to be nothing but falsehood and deception. But Hector reminded his companion that this was only a brief ordeal through which they must pass to perfect freedom. I know how painful it is for you, darling, the Major said tenderly, but in a few days we shall be far away from all this wretchedness in the dear little Brittany village I have told you of so often, with the mountains behind us and the sea before, and then we will go on to Italy and wander from place to place till you come some day to the spot in which you would like to live. And there I will build you the brightest home that a man ever made for his idol. But you, Hector, your career, your ambition? My career is finished, and I have no ambition except to be with you. He had said the same thing 100 times, in 100 different fashions, but today the tender words could not bring the faintest smile to Cecil's face. She knew that she was about to commit a terrible sin, and she had none of the passionate recklessness which can alone sustain the sinner. A stronger will than her own was carrying her along the fatal pathway, and a perverted sense of honor kept her faithful to the promise which had been extorted from her by her lover's despair. She was like that unhappy knight whose honor rooted in dishonor stood. All the details of the flight had been planned by Hector before this afternoon, but he had found some difficulty in explaining them to Cecil. The paltry details seemed more detestable than the sin itself, and the soldier's pride and delicacy alike revolted against the necessities of his position. Yet in due course all had been arranged. Cecil was to go straight to Brunswick Square, there to make hurried preparations for her flight, and to write her farewell letter to her husband, who would have started on his western journey before she left the north. In Brunswick Square she was to see Hector, who would come to her in the course of the day to assure himself of her safe arrival, and on the following morning they were to meet at the station in time to leave London by the Dover mail. Before Mr. O'Boynville returned to town they would be far away, and there would be little trace of them left to mark the way by which they had gone. Chapter 31. On the Brink. Major Gordon left Pevenshall by the mail, and on the following morning Cecil bade adieu to her friend, who was rather inclined to resent her abrupt departure. "I don't believe a bit in Mr. O'Boynville's summons," said Flo. "You are tired of us, and you want to go away, Cecil. You are deceiving me just as you deceived me before. However, of course I cannot keep you here against your will, and I can only regret that we have not succeeded in making you happy." Whereupon Cecil declared that Pevenshall was all that is delightful, and that she should never forget Mrs. Lobbier's kindness and affection. The impulsive Florence would upon this have embraced her friend, but Cecil drew herself away from the embrace. "Wherever you go, dear, I shall remember you and your goodness," she said. "And oh, Florence, I hope you will be happy." As the two women stood for a moment holding each other's hands and looking in each other's faces, Cecil would fain have uttered some word of warning to the friend she never thought to see again. But she remembered what a mockery any warning must seem hereafter from her tainted lips, though who so well as this poor shipwrecked creature, newly foundered on a rock, could tell of the dangers that beset a woman's pathway. Holding Mrs. Lobier's hand silently in her own, she fancied how her friend would remember that parting when her own name had become a byword and reproach. "Will she have any pity upon me, I wonder, for the sake of our past friendship, or will she be as merciless as the rest of the world?" This is what Cecil thought in that parting moment, while her packages were being put in the carriage, and the imperturbable footman attended with her shawls and parasols. "You will come to us at Christmas," cried Flo. "I fear not, dear. Goodbye." Cecil was seated in the carriage in the next minute, waving her hand to Florence and a little group of young ladies who had placed themselves at the hall door to witness her departure. Splendid Pevenshall swam before her in a mist as she looked at that group of light-hearted girls fluttering like a cluster of butterflies in the morning sunshine. "I shall never again pass the threshold of such a house," she thought. All through the homeward journey she felt like a traveller in a dream. She sat in a corner of the carriage with her eyes fixed upon the changing landscape, but she saw only a confusion of undulating cornfields and summer verdure. She went mechanically through the business of her arrival and reached Brunswick Square without accident, but the clamour of the London streets sounded in her ears like the booming of a stormy sea. An unearthly quiet seemed to pervade the Bloomsbury mansion. The respectful Pupkin uttered some faint exclamation of surprise on beholding his mistress, but beyond this Cecil heard neither voice nor sound. She avoided her own apartments while they were being prepared for her reception and went straight to the drawing rooms where everything remained exactly as she had left it 5 or 6 weeks before. The birds set up a feeble rejoicing as they recognized their mistress, but she did not approach the window where their cages hung in the London sunshine. She looked at her watch. Her life today was a question of hours. She had her packing to accomplish, a painful kind of packing, for it involved the setting aside of every trinket her husband had ever given her. She intended to take with her only the plainest dresses and the absolute necessaries of her toilet. She doubted whether even these things could be really hers when once she crossed the threshold of that house. There seemed to be a kind of dishonesty in taking with her the most insignificant trifle that had been bought with Lawrence O'Boynville's money. There was one task before Lady Cecil even more painful than the preparations for her journey, and that task was the writing of the letter which should tell Mr. O'Boynville that his wife had decided on leaving him. How could she do it? How could she put her wickedness into words? What could she say to him? "You have never been unkind to me. I have no accusation to bring against you. You have only been unsympathetic, and a man whom I love better than truth and honor has persuaded me to abandon you." Never in all her life had Cecil suffered such anguish as the writing of that letter cost her. It seemed a cold, hard, cruel letter when it was written, so curtly did it announce her guilty design. But though there was little trace of feeling in the written lines, the slow tears rolled down her pallid cheeks as she wrote, and her hand trembled so violently that it was with difficulty she could make her writing legible. "Oh, Hector," she cried piteously, "if you could know what I suffer for your sake. For your sake." Somehow or other, the letter was written, sealed, and addressed, and then she sat looking at it in a kind of stupor. If it were really not too late, if I dared ask him to release me, she thought. But in the next moment she remembered the solemn nature of her promise, the sacrifice her lover had made to win it. "Oh, no, no, no," she cried. "It is too late. I am bound to him by my promise." And then she asked herself whether, if there had been no such promise, she could have remained in that house as Lawrence O'Boynville's wife. She had wronged him so much in word and in thought that her innocence of deeper and more irrevocable wrong seemed to be of little moment. Could she look in his face without humiliation? Could she accept his confidence without dishonor? No, 1,000 times no, and this being so, she was no wife for him. Come what may, I must leave my husband, she thought. Oh, if I could go alone, if I could only go away by myself to some quiet hiding place and never be heard of any more. She thought this in all sincerity. Her love for the tempter had been in a great measure annihilated by the horror of the temptation. The sense of her guilt was so great an agony that there was little room in her mind for any other feeling. It seemed as if the current of fate was drifting her along, and that she was no more than a weed carried onward by an impetuous torrent. She knew that destruction lay before her, but she had no power to resist the force of the stream. After the writing of the letter, she sat for some time in a listless attitude, looking vacantly at the envelope with her husband's name upon it. Her head ached with a dull pain, and there was confusion in her thoughts. She could not ponder deliberately upon the step that she was going to take. This inability to think quietly had possessed her ever since she had arrived at the fatal conclusion to which her lover had urged her. She had accepted the doctrine of necessity. She had allowed herself to be persuaded that it was her destiny to do wrong. And once having yielded to this unnatural creed, the false god she had created was stronger than herself, and she became indeed a powerless creature in the hands of fate. Apollo had spoken. Sorrow and shame lay before her, her inevitable portion. The day crept on, and she knew that with every hour the current that was drifting her gathered new strength. Hector was to devote this day to the settlement of his own affairs, for a man has need to make some little preparation on the eve of an exile that may last his lifetime. The day crept on, a dull, sultry day at the close of August, and still Cecil kept her listless attitude by the table with her husband's letter lying before her. She knew that she was not to expect any visit from Hector until late in the afternoon, since the business he had to transact would occupy the best part of his day. But though she was lonely and wretched, she felt no eagerness for his coming. What relief or consolation could he bring her? What was he but her accomplice in wrong, with whom she had plotted a crime, and to whom she was pledged for the due accomplishment of that evil deed? Amid the many thoughts that succeeded one another in the confusion of her brain, there was the thought that guilty wretches who had plotted the details of a murder must feel very much as she felt today. She could fancy them when all had been planned, and the hour appointed, waiting in weary idleness for the time to come. She could fancy them watching the slow hands upon the dial, and wishing either that time could come to a dead stop for ever and ever, or that the hour had arrived and the deed were done. The stillness of the house seemed to her like the stillness that precedes death and horror. She fancied her husband coming home from his journey in a day or two to find the same dull quiet in the house, and his wife's letter waiting for him on the table. If he loved me, the blow would kill him, she thought. But he does not love me. His profession is all the world to him. If he had loved me, I think it would have been easy for me to confess my wickedness and ask his forgiveness. He will be sorry, perhaps, more sorry for me than for himself, but his grief will not last long. He will have Westminster Hall and his hope of getting into Parliament. He is not like Hector. He would never have allowed his love for me to interfere with his career. It was nearly 5 o'clock when she aroused herself from this miserable apathy and went to her room to begin the preparations for tomorrow's flight. She was to dine at 6:30, so she had brief leisure for her work. One by one she set aside the jewels that her husband had given her. They were not very numerous, but they were valuable, and in a simple taste that did credit to Mr. O'Boynville's judgment. Like that wretched wife in Kotzebue's tragedy, Lady Cecil could not fail to remember the occasion on which each gift had been presented. The emerald and diamond bracelet on her birthday, the cameos in Etruscan setting on the anniversary of her marriage, the suite of turquoise rings and bracelets in solid bands of lustreless gold bestowed upon her in commemoration of some professional triumph of Mr. O'Boynville's, as grand in its way as Erskine's defence of Hardy. The thought of her husband's quiet pleasure in these offerings came back to her as she touched them. "I think he must have loved me then," she murmured, as she remembered the evening on which he had taken the case of cameos from his pocket to lay it on the little table by which she sat at work. He had loved her a little at that time, she thought. He had loved her a little when he sought her as his wife, but always with that moderate and negative affection for which alone there is room in the breast of a man who devotes himself to an arduous profession. It had not been given to Cecil to understand the possibility of hidden fires burning steadily beneath the dull outward crust of the working man's nature. She did not know the capacity for deep and passionate feeling which may exist in the nature of a man whose daily labor leaves him no leisure for the revelation of the better and brighter part of his mind. She had expected to find a husband only an improved edition of a lover, and finding him something altogether different, a creature who accepted her affection as a matter of course and was disagreeably candid on the subject of an unbecoming bonnet, she concluded all at once that she was no longer beloved and that her life was desolate. The dismal dinner hour had arrived by the time she had collected the trinkets in her jewel case and had packed 2 or 3 dresses and her most indispensable possessions in the one trunk which she was to take with her. She went to the dining room and made a miserable pretence of dining, with the inestimable Pupkin in attendance and the evening sunlight shining into the dingy pictures on the wall opposite to her. Everything in Brunswick Square looked unspeakably dull and faded and dusty after the splendour of Pevenshaw. She thought of the moonlit terrace and the fair summer landscape sanctified by the night. The very tones of Hector Gordon's passionate pleading came back to her ears, but they moved her with no answering thrill of passion. Her love had perished in the misery which it had brought upon her. She thought of that little village in Brittany which he had described to her so eloquently, the rustic retreat in which they were to spend the first few months of their union. Oh, God, what a union! A vague horror was mingled even with the thought of that pine-clad mountain and the purple sea. Her lover had dwelt so fondly on the beauty of the scene. And yet, in Brunswick Square, with the summer sunshine coming to her on a slanting column of dust, and with a street organ droning in the distance, she thought of that far-away paradise with a shudder. In this crisis of her fate, she felt like a creature standing between two lives, the dull, slow river of commonplace existence, the stormy ocean of passion and guilt. She looked backward to the river with a vague yearning. She looked forward to the ocean with an unutterable fear. The shadowy banquet occupied less than half an hour, and it was only 7 o'clock when Cecil went back to the drawing-room. 7. He would be with her soon. He too would have made his pretence of dining, no doubt, at one of his clubs. The crisis in a well-bred man's fate must be desperate indeed when he abandons that pretence of dining, or faces the universe with a reckless toilet. 7. The windows were open. The canaries were making a discordant scraping with their beaks against the wires of the cages, and noisy children were emerging from the square. Cecil looked down at them from her window and remembered the stories she had heard of women who had run away from such households as those. She remembered one especial history, the wretched story of a woman who abandoned her husband and children under the influence of an infatuation which remained an unsolvable mystery to the last. It was from Brighton that the hapless creature took flight, and she told one of the few friends who remained to her after that time how at the last, just as she had crossed the threshold of her husband's house, she heard, or fancied that she heard, a cry from one of her children, and would have gone back, would at that ultimate moment have repented and returned, if a cruel wind had not closed the door in her face and set the seal upon her doom. She had not the courage to ring the bell. She went away to keep her tryst with the man who had made himself her master, and to have her name a byword and reproach forever after that fatal day. The wheels of an impetuous hansom ground against the curbstone, while Lady Cecil stood at the window thinking of this dismal story, and her lover alighted from the vehicle. He stopped to pay the driver. He must have paid the driver even if he had been going to assist in the execution of a murder, and the man drove away slowly through the smoky summer, gloaming, contented with his fare. Cecil was still standing by the window when Pupkin announced Major Gordon. She turned her head and waited for her lover, and even in that moment of waiting, as he came towards her through the twilit room, she thought how different would have been her greeting of him if she had been his wife, if she had had any right to be glad of his coming. "My own darling," said Hector, in a low, tender voice. She gave him her hand in silence, and he stood by her side in the window, holding the poor cold hand and looking down at her with unutterable affection. "My own dear girl, how pale you are in this dim light. I hope it is the light, and that you are not really looking so ill as I fancy you look. I have done everything, dear. I have seen the lawyers, the bankers, the stockbrokers, everybody, and am free to go to the end of the world, to the very end of the world. Look up, darling. Let me see the face I used to dream of on my way back to India, after our parting at Fortinbras." She lifted her head from its drooping attitude and looked at him with a countenance in which there was a mournful resignation that sent a chill to his heart. "Oh, my darling, if you could only look forward as happily to our future as I do. I know that there is much for you to suffer, just at first, but when once we are clear of England and all the brightest countries in the universe are before us, the miserable past will fade away like a dream." "Do you think so, Hector? Shall I ever forget? Shall I ever forget?" "Let it be considered my fault if you remember. I charge myself with the happiness of your life. You cannot blame me too bitterly if you are unhappy. And now, darling, let us discuss our plans for the last time. I hope they won't bring us lights. It is so nice to sit in this dreamy twilight. I shall always think tenderly of Brunswick Square for the sake of this one evening. Cecil." They sat by the open window, and Hector talked about the future. He talked about the future, which, by his showing, was to be one long idyll. And while he talked, the woman who sat by his side would fain have cast herself at his feet, crying, "Release me from my guilty promise. Have pity upon me, and set me free." She would fain have done this, but she sat by his side and listened quietly to hopeful words that jarred strangely with the dull anguish which had possessed her all through the long, wretched day. They were still sitting in the summer dusk when a firmer footstep than Pupkin's sounded on the landing place, and the door suddenly opened. "Lawrence!" cried Cecil, starting to her feet as she recognized the stalwart figure in the doorway. It was indeed Mr. O'Boynville, with the dust of travel upon him. He took his wife in his arms and kissed her tenderly, and he gave friendly greeting to Major Gordon, but he did not offer his hand to that gentleman. "Pupkin told me of your return," he said to Cecil. "What brought you back so unexpectedly?" It was some moments before Cecil answered, and even then she could not reply without hesitation. "I was so tired of Pevenshaw. Tired of Pevenshaw. I thought you were enjoying yourself so much there. Well, dear, you were quite right to come back if you were tired. Let us have the lights and some tea." The barrister went to the fireplace to ring one of the bells. He happened to choose the bell nearest that angle of the chimney-piece on which Cecil had placed two sealed envelopes addressed to her husband. One contained the letter announcing her flight, the other the key of her jewel case and wardrobe. Mr. O'Boynville's piercing gaze alighted on these letters as he rang the bell. "For me?" he asked, advancing his hand towards the two packets. "No," Cecil cried eagerly. "They are mine." She snatched them from the mantelpiece and put them in her pocket, and then she seated herself by the table on which she was wont to make tea. Mr. O'Boynville walked slowly up and down the room. Major Gordon kept his place by the open window. Nothing could be more inconvenient than this unlooked-for return of the barrister, which in all probability would interfere with the arrangements of the next day. The Major felt all the degradation of his position, but was determined to hold his ground nevertheless. The barrister would most likely retire to his study directly after tea, and thereby afford Hector the opportunity of speaking to Cecil before he left. There was an unspeakable dreariness, a palpable desolation in that Bloomsbury drawing-room, which oppressed Hector Gordon as he stood by the window, looking sometimes out into the square where the lamps burned dimly in the grey evening light, sometimes into the dusky room where the barrister's figure loomed large athwart the shadows. Cecil sat in a listless attitude, waiting to perform that simple household duty which must seem such a mockery to her tonight. The lamps came presently, and the big plated tea-tray and old-fashioned urn with impossible lion heads holding rings in their mouths. The light of the lamps was painfully dazzling to her aching eyes. She began to pour out the tea mechanically, and the two men came to the table to take their cups from her hands. As they stood side by side doing this, the thought arose in her mind of that one treason which stands alone amongst all the treasons of mankind, and the figure of her lover bending over the cups and saucers blended itself horribly with the image of Judas Iscariot dipping his hand into the dish. Mr. O'Boynville drank his tea after his usual absent-minded fashion, staring into space as he slowly sipped the beverage. He rose after emptying his second cup and began to pace the room again, while Hector sat near the lamp-lit table, watching Cecil with anxious, earnest eyes. "You scarcely expected me tonight, I suppose, Cecil," said the barrister. "No, I did not expect you. I didn't think I should return so soon. But the business I am involved in just now is a very serious one." "Indeed." She spoke mechanically, feeling herself called upon to speak. Hector did not even affect any interest in Mr. O'Boynville's conversation. A kind of sullenness had taken possession of him since the barrister's entrance, and he kept his place silently with a dogged determination to remain, knowing all the time that he had no right to be there, and that Cecil's husband had good reason to wonder at his presence. "Yes, it is a very unpleasant business, a painful business. Of course, I have only to consider the technicalities involved in it. I am consulted on a question that has arisen respecting a marriage settlement, but when people want a counsel's opinion, they are obliged to tell him other things besides technicalities. I am very sorry for the poor woman." "What poor woman?" asked Cecil, still because she felt herself obliged to appear interested. "The poor, deluded creature who has left her husband. If a thunderbolt had fallen through the roof of Mr. O'Boynville's house, Cecil could scarcely have experienced a greater shock, but she gave no utterance to her feelings. She sat pale and motionless, like some unhappy wretch at a bar of justice waiting the awful sentence. "Ah, I forgot," said the barrister. "You don't know the story. As I said just now, it's not a pleasant story, and perhaps I ought not to talk to you about it. But I can't get it out of my head. And yet it's common enough, heaven knows. Only it seems a little worse in this case than usual, for the husband and wife had lived so happily together." "Why did she leave him?" This time it seemed to Cecil as if some unknown force within her compelled the question. So painful was the nature of her husband's conversation, so unwilling would she have been to continue it had she possessed the power of bringing it to an end. "Why did she leave him?" repeated the barrister. "Who can tell? There are women in Bethlehem Hospital who believe themselves to be queens of England, and there are miserable creatures in the same asylum who have murdered families of helpless children in sudden paroxysms of madness. But not one amongst them all could seem to me more utterly mad than this woman." "You know the husband?" said Hector Gordon. He had risen during the barrister's discourse and was standing by the mantelpiece. He felt himself in a manner called upon to take some part in this discussion and to defend the sinners if necessary. "Yes, I know the husband. Was he so devoted to his wife?" "I am not quite sure of your idea of devotion. You see, you are a clubman, Major Gordon. You belong to the West End and to a set of men who can afford to be what you call devoted. I don't suppose you could realize the idea of a stockbroker's affection for his wife. Your city man has very little opportunity for playing the ideal lover or the ideal husband. His wife's image may be with him even on 'change. The details of his business are dry and dull and sordid in the eyes of other people, but he may be working for his wife all the time, and his existence may be more completely consecrated to her welfare and to her happiness than if he dawdled by her side all day on the margin of some romantic Italian lake and only opened his lips to protest the singleness of his affection. Yes, Major Gordon, the city man's devotion is the nobler, for it takes the form of unremitting toil and unending care, while the dawdler's love is only a shallow pretext for a sensuous laziness amidst beautiful scenery. I confess myself sceptical on the subject of your stockbroking Romeo," said Hector with a sneer. "With that sort of man, a wife is only a superior kind of housekeeper. I don't believe in the poetry of Bartholomew Lane. Your city man works hard because money-making is his habit, his vice, like dram drinking, not because he wants to make a fortune for his wife and children." "You think so?" "Most assuredly, I think so." "And you do not believe that your hard-working man has his own bright picture of an ideal home always before his mind? I don't think you can have studied the habits of Englishmen, Major Gordon, or you would understand the city man better. Look about you, and behold the incarnation of English prosperity in the Englishman's home. It is for that he works. It is in order to achieve that luxurious haven that he wastes the best years of his life in the smoke and dust and heat and turmoil of the commercial battleground. And what does his home represent, with all its splendor of pictures and furniture and gardens and stables, but his devotion to his wife and children? Build what palace he may, his clubs will give him better rooms than he can build for himself. Whatever salary he pays his cook, there will be better cooks at the Reform or the London Tavern. But the hard-working Englishman wants a home, a dining room in which his children may gather around him as he sips his famous claret, a drawing room where, amidst all the splendor, there will be a corner for his wife's work-basket, a hiding place for his baby's last new toy. And you eloquent drones of the West End see this poor working bee, this dust-begrimed money-grub, and you say such a creature cannot know what it is to love his wife, and if the wife happens to be a pretty woman, you have neither pity nor respect for the husband. Poor, miserable, money-earning machine, what is he that he should be pitied or respected? It can be no sin to bring ruin and desolation upon such a creature's home." "You are eloquent tonight, Mr. O'Boynville." "Oh, you know it is my trade to be eloquent about other people's business. I really do feel for this poor man. I've been in his house today. Such a house! I could have fancied there had been a funeral, and that the coffin had only just been taken away. There was such palpable desolation in the place. "And the husband?" asked Cecil, with real interest this time. "Was he sorry?" "Sorry? Can you fancy the sorrow for a loss which is so much worse than death that it would be happiness to the mourner if he could awake from a dream to find his wife's coffin by his side? Sorry? Do you know what a broken life is?" "I do, Cecil. There are 3 lives ruined and broken by a woman's folly." "Let the man who loves her bear the full burden of his guilt," said Hector eagerly. "Let him be responsible for the issue." "God help him, poor creature," cried the barrister. "You pity him." "How can I help pitying him? You read of such a case in the papers and think perhaps that the seducer is a very fine fellow. He has persuaded a silly woman to make her name a public disgrace, and he has destroyed an honest man's existence. All that sounds very heroic. People wonder what diabolical charm the villain possessed. There are piquant paragraphs about him in the papers, a social leader holding him up to the execration of the million, but with a little flourish of poetry and passion for his glorification notwithstanding. And if his photograph could be published while his misdeeds had the gloss of novelty upon them, it would sell by thousands. But have you ever thought about the lives of these people after the 9 days' wonder is over, and they slip out of the public mind? Then comes the chastisement. Then comes the old classic retribution, evil for evil, evil for evil. The man who did not scruple to destroy the entire scheme of another man's existence finds his own life wasted and broken. What is the universe for him henceforward? A solitude with the one wretched creature whom he has chosen for his companion. There can be no such thing as solitude with the woman he loves. The man who outrages honor and defies society will find his home something worse than a solitude, a prison in which 2 galley slaves pace to and fro, dragging at the hateful chain that links them together. Let the seducer love his victim never so fondly. The time too surely comes in which he learns to hate her. The time comes when the voice of a forgotten ambition reminds him how much he has sacrificed. For what? For the pale face of a penitent whose wan eyes are filled with involuntary tears at the sight of the humblest peasant woman walking by her husband's side. "A man must be a dastard who could count any sacrifice made for the woman he loves," said the Major. "The man who steals another man's wife is a dastard," answered Mr. O'Boynville. "Sooner or later he will count the cost of his folly, and the woman who has staked her salvation against the love of this one creature will awake some day to find that the game is lost. She will see the reflection of her own remorse in her lover's face, blended with something worse than remorse. She will watch his dreary, purposeless life, spent in a foreign country, under a false name most likely, and she will think what he might have been but for her. Heaven help her! She must have a servile love of life for its own sake if she does not creep quietly from the house some dusky evening to drown herself in the nearest river. Nothing but her death can set her lover free, and even her death cannot extinguish the disgrace she has inflicted on her husband's name." A half-stifled sob sounded through the room as the barrister came to a full stop. He went to his wife and found her crying, with her hands clasped before her face. "Forgive me, my dear," he said gently. "I forgot that this sort of story was not the thing to speak of before you. I let myself talk as if I were in court. Why are you going away, Major? My wife will be better presently. We won't say anything more about these miserable runaways. Look up, Cecil. There, you are all right now. Must you really go?" This question was addressed to Hector, who had taken up his hat and was waiting to make his adieu. "Yes, it is 10 o'clock. I will call upon Lady Cecil tomorrow. I have something particular to say to her." "Then I'm afraid that you must defer the something particular for a week or two. I'm going to take my wife to Devonshire by an early train tomorrow. Good night, but I'm coming down to my study so I can let you out myself." "Good night, Lady Cecil." "Good night." The words were scarcely audible. She rose as she gave him her hand, and they stood for a few moments face to face, while Mr. O'Boynville walked towards the door. Hector mutely imploring some sign, Cecil looking at him with a blank, stupefied expression. To leave her thus, and on such a night, The night, which was to have been the eve of a new life, was unspeakable anguish. But he had no alternative. The barrister's eye was upon him, and a word, a look might have betrayed the woman he loved. He had no opportunity to ascertain whether tomorrow's appointment at the railway station was to be kept, or whether Mr. O'Boynville's return was to hinder Cecil's flight. He could only take his departure after the fashion of the most commonplace visitor, and must trust all tomorrow's schemes and tomorrow's hopes to the chapter of accidents. "Good night, Lady Cecil," he repeated, and he tried to put as much meaning into those two words as can be infused into any two syllables of the English language. Mr. O'Boynville conducted his guest to the street door and lingered on the threshold with him a few moments, talking pleasantly. "You really think of going to the west of England tomorrow?" asked the Major. "There is no such thing as honour when a man is engaged in a dishonourable cause." And not being able to talk to the wife, Hector Gordon was fain to extract the information he required from the husband. "Yes," answered Mr. O'Boynville. "I have business in that part of the country, and as my wife is not looking well, I shall take her with me. A week or two at Clovelly or some sea-coast village will set her up." "Shall you start early?" "Yes, by the 8 o'clock train." 8:30 was the hour for the Dover mail, and at 1/4 Cecil and Hector were to have met at the station. All had been planned by the Major. She was to have told her servants that she was going into Hampshire to join her aunt, and was to have ordered a hack cab to take her to the station. All had been thought of, but now delay was inevitable, and Hector had a presentiment that in this case delay meant the ruin of his hopes. He bade good night to the barrister, and went away from the quiet Bloomsbury quarter with a heavy heart. Mr. O'Boynville smiled as he closed the door upon the departing visitor. "Thank God it's all over so quietly," he muttered to himself. "It was best to take matters coolly. It would always have been open to me to blow his brains out." The barrister did not go to his study. He went back to the drawing-room, where he found his wife lying prostrate on the spot where Hector Gordon had bade her adieu. He lifted her in his arms and carried her upstairs as easily as if she had been an infant. He rang for one of the maids to attend on his unconscious wife, but before doing so, and before making any effort to restore Cecil from her fainting fit, he deliberately picked her pocket of the 2 letters which she had taken from the mantelpiece. Rapid as her movement had been when she took possession of these 2 packets, the barrister's piercing glances had discovered that they were addressed to himself. "It's better that I should have them than anyone else," he said, as he transferred the letters to his own pocket. He left Cecil in the care of the housemaid and sent for a medical man who had occasionally attended his wife. All that night he sat by Cecil's bedside, and through the greater part of the next day he still kept his post. There was no journey to Devonshire, and Hector Gordon, calling day by day in Brunswick Square, with a desperate defiance of appearances, was apt to find a doctor's brougham standing at the door, and for some time received an invariable answer from Pupkin. Lady Cecil O'Boynville was still very ill. It was a long, wearisome illness, a low fever with frequent delirium and a most terrible languor of mind and body. But slow and wearisome as the malady was in its nature, Lawrence O'Boynville knew no such thing as fatigue. He nursed his wife as tenderly as ever mother nursed her fading child, snatching his broken sleep or his hasty meal how and where he could, and carrying a bag full of briefs for the coming term to the sick chamber, there to read and ponder in the dead of the night, with ears always on the alert for the faintest variation in the low breathing of the beloved sleeper, and with his watch open before him to mark the hour when medicines were to be administered. The hired nurse who performed the commoner duties of the sick chamber snored peacefully in Cecil's dressing-room during the dismal night watch, and was loud in her praises of the husband's devotion, which, if there was more like him, our duties wouldn't be that wearing as they are, and there'd be less complaints of giving way to stimulants, and gentlemen, which should be above blackening a poor woman's character, would have no call to throw their Sarey Gampses and Betsy Priggses in a lone female's face, said this member of the Gamp species.